Hi, welcome to my talk today, Rapid Application Development for Emergency Response Scenarios. Today I'm going to offer some anecdotes and examples based on my personal experience serving with the Florida National Guard over the past 9.5 years, including participating in the state response efforts for 5 different hurricanes that hit the state. So here's the proposal that I put forward. The biggest thing you can take away out of this is that I threw a lot of buzzwords in there because that was able to get the proposal accepted. So some of you might wonder how a talk on application development got picked up for a conference that was nominally focused on security. To be honest, I'm humbled that my proposal was selected because it probably isn't in the wheelhouse of the presentations and workshops being shared this week. The reason I wanted a chance to speak was because it's rare that someone in my lane, an artilleryman and an M-Day National Guard soldier no less, has a chance to speak to the collected community of technologists representing a cross-section of the Department of Defense. In the 5 hurricanes that I've responded to, far too often I've seen the difficulty in managing the personnel and equipment while maintaining a cohesive common operating picture during rapidly evolving situations. Something that I've noticed is a lot of times with people with an aptitude for technology, information management in particular, they can be force multipliers for their commanders. So this talk digs into 3 areas in particular in which we're able to leverage off-the-shelf and commercial low-code solutions to help increase the awareness and responsiveness of our National Guard battalion. And by extension, we're able to better help and serve the communities that we were responding to. So before I tell you what I know, I think it's important that you know where it comes from. My name is Matt Wagner. I'm a currently serving officer in the Florida National Guard. I've been in the Army, like I said, for a little bit over 9 years now. I'm a field artilleryman by trade, which I'll admit is probably not the Army branch you think of when you think of software nerds. But I found that probably that nerd skills that I bring to the table come in handy probably a little bit more than my actual artillery skills, specifically in response scenarios like we're going to talk about today. In my civilian job, I'm the director of engineering for Red Lake Dev, which is a software development agency responsible for custom development and consulting for small and medium-sized businesses. I also do some open source work on my GitHub account, including automating DoD forms, soldier tracking, PT test grading, basically trying to automate my job when I was a lieutenant. And the picture you see up there was when I was part of the National Guard Task Force for the 58th presidential inauguration, which is a pretty cool opportunity to kind of see behind the scenes. And as I record this presentation, it is the day after the election, and we're still counting up the votes. So it'd be a really cool opportunity to get a chance to go back up for the 59th presidential inauguration in January. So this is your typical disclaimer, not to take anything I say or the products I highlight as an endorsement, as my views do not represent the Florida National Guard, the United States Army, the Department of Defense, or really anyone other than Matt Wagner. So when you're a member of the Florida National Guard, you tend to watch the news with a bit more specificity during hurricane season. You have marked on your calendar the start and end of the hurricane season. Because occasionally you turn on the TV and you see craziness like this. At that point, you have to rapidly pack your kit, hit the road, and be ready for some dynamic challenges. You don't know where that storm's going to go, you don't know where you're going to end up, and you don't know necessarily what you're going to get asked to do. Thankfully, in 2020, we haven't had to respond to any storms. As the past 5 years, it's generally meant 2 to 3 weeks on active duty as part of the state response. So I like this photo. It looks like it was staged. The newspaper reporter that was embedded with us on our response efforts managed to set me up for this photo by telling me, she had to stop and fix her camera. Turns out she was setting me up for the really nice looking photo. So this is one of my small claims to fame as a National Guardsman. And this photo gives you a little bit of context about some of the situations that you run into when you're in the Florida National Guard. This is one of those times when your higher headquarters decides it's time to park your unit directly in the path of a Category 4 storm. Just go and ride it out in a minor league baseball stadium. So that was a pretty fun experience. So what is the problem? What is it we're actually trying to solve? This is a couple of the friction points that we end up getting to when we're on state active duty. So every hurricane, I see new reporting formats proliferate. Each echelon might require slightly different aggregation or slightly different format, whether they want it in Excel, they want a table, they want PDF format, maybe they want it via text message, or maybe they want it sliced and diced based on the number of M-Day soldiers versus your ADR soldiers. There's also requirements for the data points can change as the operation extends. What you need to know before the storm hits is usually something different than what you need to know a week after the storm, whether you need to know what kind of the pre-positioned stock is versus what your resources available are, your personnel available is a week, 2 weeks after the storm. A lot of it also depends on who is receiving and forwarding the request for information. Is oftentimes different units or different headquarters units will add new requirements. And so this all kind of feeds back into a process that the reporting requirements change, and they change throughout the operation. One static system does not meet all needs. Oftentimes you also end up with widely distributed task force. Whether your platoon or your company or your battalion is spread over multiple sites, multiple points of distribution, and perhaps even multiple counties. How does someone running a recovery site, running a point of distribution, a pod site, maybe with limited power access, sometimes the requirements come down that you need to be updating a SharePoint tracker. You need to have something that requires CAC access to get to. So these are some of the problems that we tend to run into every hurricane that comes up. The last one on here is, where is this convoy going? How do we navigate to places we've never been? Quite often we'll get a requirement to move across the state on short notice to a location we've never been. Sometimes we're asked to move and we'll get the movement order before we actually even know the destination. Sometimes while you're driving, you'll find out where it is you're actually going. How do we know what's open? Maybe what fuel stations are available? Those sorts of things are all things you have to deal with on the road during a response effort. So some of the previous solutions we worked through, the butcher block you see up here, paper is one of the natural solutions that you tend to go for in this sort of scenario. But it also exemplifies some of the difficulties associated with battle tracking, because naturally a piece of paper is only available at one point in time. The people that can actually see the piece of paper are the only ones that actually have this information. So it gets out of date very quickly. It's hard to update. It's hard to share that information. How do we know it's current? Who maintains it? So these are some of the problems with paper. Oftentimes you'll also see a proliferation of text messages. I know there's been several hurricanes where I've ended up being in 3, 4, 5 different group messages, just trying to share information, whether it's inside the platoon, inside of the battery, inside of the battalion, or with liaison officers operating in different parts of the county. Oftentimes this ends up being on personal computers, personal phones. For instance, I bought a battery pack to help me run my laptop during hurricane operations. I've seen full-time staff, those AGR guys, end up bringing their government laptops along with a box to store the printer, because quite often you just need paper for hand receipts and head counts. All of these are very hard friction points to deal with, because not everyone has access to the same sorts of tools that you'll have. Another thing to note from the butcher block on the right includes a point of contact at a location. Oftentimes when you're in the National Guard for these sorts of scenarios, you'll have a private, a specialist, maybe a junior sergeant being the point of contact at the location. And so we're putting a lot of trust in them to be the face of the National Guard during that response, keeping situational awareness, pushing those status updates to higher, and making sure that everyone keeps up to date with all the reporting requirements. So a JBCP or satellite phone would also be a great thing to have. Quite often in these sorts of situations, what I've seen is the satellite phones are only issued to like battalion commanders. Very rarely, they're not really available for lower echelons. And the JBCP seems like it would be great for this sort of situation. It's powered off the trucks, it has satellite connectivity, but I've rarely actually seen it used to any effect. And more than once, we've actually left the armory quickly to get out the door to get in position for a storm and actually not taking the hard drives for the system. So a couple examples of some of the battle tracking that we're required to do. So if you see on the right-hand side the reporting method, because it's very easy when you're out running a point of distribution or running a shelter to send 7 emails a day in the required reporting format up to the battery, up to the battalion, up to the brigade level. And it really shows some of the disconnect between the reporting needs of higher and the ability of lower to actually support that reporting. So this one's a telling photo of me. So this was during my first hurricane response with the state. We actually pulled the convoy off to fuel up at a gas station en route to another location. And I had to run inside and use the subway, because the subway's table, because they had power and they had Wi-Fi. It's much easier to do the paperwork and do the reporting requirements here than in the back of a Humvee, because I've tried to do that. It can work, which is part of the reason I bought a battery pack. I bought a hard shell case for my computer, which you don't see in this picture, because I learned after these first couple iterations. You can see the sign in the background about 1 case of water per customer, because those are the sort of situations you run into, is how do you maintain supplies for your soldiers as well. This is another example of one of those minutia that ends up being a reporting requirement sometimes during hurricane response. We needed to track the current odometer reading sometimes twice a day on every piece of rolling stock. So as you can tell, it gets to be very intricate data points that get aggregated and pushed up to different echelons of command. Not really sure what kind of decision making this was driving, but these are the crazy things that end up going into the reports that higher wants to make their decisions. This is another example. You end up in oftentimes like this Excel table hell or this tab hell. This particular one I think had 12 different tabs. It didn't necessarily even have a whole lot of formulas and referential data. And there were copies being emailed around for aggregation. So that gets into a really difficult situation on what's the latest copy, who owns specific areas. Trying to maintain that data integrity is pretty difficult in that sort of situation. Another example of just the detail of reporting formats. All that being said, there is an official system in many states and many counties and many cities. One of the ones is commonly used is called Web EOC by a company, I think it's called Juvair, I think is how you pronounce it. And this is often the official solution for tracking. It's not a bad system per se, but it's generally limited in my echelon that I generally work at, limited to read-only access, specifically to your liaison officers operating in your emergency operations centers. All the missions from the state, from different counties, from different municipalities come in through Web EOC and get pushed up the civilian chain of command and then end up coming back down from the Joint Operations Center through the military chain of command to us. So that is an option, but we quite often find is there's so much information flowing through the system. It's very difficult to follow, and it's generally not intended in many ways for the military chain of command. There's been times where we've been sitting in an emergency operations center next to our liaison officer, see a mission that's quite clearly demarcated for our unit. We have the people on the ground, we'll have the equipment on the ground, but by the time the mission gets entered in by the people in the OC, up through the state JOC, down through brigade, down to us, oftentimes the situation will be gone. We could have already solved the problem. And naturally, that's something you want to try and expedite as much as possible during an emergency response scenario. But it's also really difficult because it doesn't necessarily line up with the way the military chain of command works, is you don't get to necessarily see the roll-ups based on a company or a battery or a battalion or a brigade, those task forces. So that's one of the things that we end up running into. And quite often we'll have our own reporting formats to help mitigate some of that. So those were just a few of the examples of some of the problems we run into, some of the data aggregations. So now I'm going to get into a little bit of some of the solutions that we found or we built in order to solve those problems. And so the low code or no code movement, it's really not a movement until it has a hashtag. And one of the big keys of the low code, no code tools is finding one that does enough of what you want to accomplish, because they all end up having their limitations. And so today I'm going to talk about some of the things that we came up with, whether they were completely off-the-shelf solutions and we customized them, or they were a low-code solution. We were able to connect some of the disparate pieces. So what is rapid application development? It's a little bit of a buzzword, along with low-code, no-code, going around quite a bit right now. But generally speaking, the way I describe it is it's drag-and-drop tooling for UI design, pre-designed components for new functionality. So you can have different pieces, whether it's a table component, a button, a way of managing data, and you can display it on the screen without necessarily needing to write any code to do it. The biggest piece and probably the biggest benefits is it does not require that manual connecting code, and you can quickly iterate on it without the long build and deployment cycles. Because quite often when you're in emergency response scenarios, we don't have time to write full unit tests for it, to go through a CI or continuous integration pipeline, a staging environment, user acceptance testing. Is you need to quickly get it out in front of the people that are going to use it, so they can start taking advantage of that, the new data points. So the no-code generation is arriving. This is TechCrunch's article. It talks a little bit about how people throughout the country, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, are using these low-code or no-code solutions to help build new information management systems, and how it's becoming almost expected that people coming up now can navigate these information management systems and design them to track their own pieces. For instance, my kids and I sat down this past weekend to build something to track their allowance, their digital bank account. So it's pretty cool the way that all these tools are kind of coming together. So the first and probably the biggest use case is battle tracking, kind of where are our trucks, where are our personnel, what kind of missions do we have going on, what is our forecasted needs over the next 24, 48 hours. So the tool that we settled on for our use case was called NAC. And similar, kind of like we talked about with the rapid application development tools, it's got that drag and drop UI design for pages. So a couple of examples you'll see on the screen are around data modeling. So I can talk about what defines a mission, whether it's a web EOC number, what county it's in, who it's assigned to, what type of mission it is. So I can start collecting those pieces of information. Similar to things that we were solving previously with spreadsheets, but now we can add a little bit more relational integrity on, that we can do additional filtering on and connecting between a unit property and a mission, vehicles, per stat, connecting all these pieces of information. So it has that relational data modeling, so maintaining that integrity of data. It has mobile access, so you can get real-time updates from the distributed echelons, and that's big. We're going to talk about here in a second. It has the ability to handle logins, roles, authentication. And the cool thing that I like to use it for is you can actually embed it inside of other websites. So if you want to embed it inside of a SharePoint tracker, embed it inside of another CMS system that you're using, content management system, and also extend it via another API. So why does the flexibility of the UI and data matter? If you remember back when we talked about the constantly evolving data points, what you need to know 3 days before a storm hits is different than what you need to know 3 days after or a week after. So you can constantly update, maybe add new data points. Maybe the colonel or the general started asking for, hey, we need to track the number of high water vehicles we have versus just number of vehicles. So then you start breaking up your data points. Instead of just tracking vehicles, you start tracking Humvees versus LMTVs versus MTVs versus wreckers. You start breaking it out, and you can still maintain that integrity of the data, but you get to change what data points, maybe change how the data is aggregated. Maybe a higher echelon needs it in a different reporting format. By using these rapid application development tools, I was able to quickly add on different properties or different data elements that we were able to track to meet all of these requirements as they evolved. Some of the limitations that I kind of mentioned about is it doesn't have a staging, there's no publish step. But that's also good, because if I'm on the phone with the battalion commander and he needs new pieces of information, is I can add that directly to the application. He can refresh and get all of those sorts of pieces of information ready for him in one without having to go through extra steps. So one of the ways we use the application is with the dashboard. So our dashboard uses embedding of real-time images from other sites. So this is actually a picture from about 2 weeks ago. So it always pulls the latest update of the tropics. So you can kind of see the information that we need to know. So anytime someone would open up the application, they would be able to see what the latest track of the storm was, maybe what kind of damage assessments there were. And this is all mobile friendly. It works better on a computer, naturally, as most things do, but it's also accessible on Android or iPhone device. And you can see along the top, you also have different nav to different parts of the application we were able to build to track different pieces of information. So these are kind of examples as well. We were tracking our logistics and our vehicles, and you can kind of see what I was talking about, being able to break it down between Humvees, LMTVs, MTVs, their GSA vehicles, fuelers, and it starts rolling it up and tracking also when the last update was, if there's any notes, so that you don't have to go nag your lower echelons for the reports. I can see, oh, well, this unit came in and updated 2 hours ago, which is on the normal reporting schedule. I don't need to go ask them if it's the latest piece of information. Same thing with your logistics. How many MREs do they have? How much fuel do they have? What kind of supplies do they need? Do they have any requests? I can look directly in the application and get it in real time without having to going through that reporting, that battle rhythm that I showed you earlier on. Those 7 emails per day is anytime there's a change that's important enough for hire to know, I can come into the app and update it. One of the other cool things you can do is you also can do pieces like adding definitions. So one of the things we ran into regarding our personnel statistics or our per stat was the definition. What does it mean for assigned strength versus attached versus detached? So we were able to talk to the S1 or our admin NCOs to get the definition of what they actually wanted in those categories, so that when people came in to update those statistics, instead of just looking at a report and wondering, I wonder what goes in this column, they were able to look directly at the definition and know what to fill out there. Same thing with tracking missions. So instead of an Excel spreadsheet with maybe non-connected pieces of information, Hero is able to build a form that they can type in the mission directly out of Web EOC or out of from what they get from Battalion and punch in the pieces of information, specifically things like the address or point of contact. So the unit that it's getting assigned to would be able to go in, hit navigate to the address or call the point of contact and get that, understand a little bit more about the mission. So one of the other things we're going to talk about in a second is using Google Maps to build these maps. But we're also able to embed situation maps into the application so that people could come in there and see the different locations we're operating, whether they were shelters, points of distribution, or even fuel stations along the way. So usually you probably don't think of Google Maps as something being as a no-code solution. It's not really coding at all, but this is probably one of the most useful pieces of technology that we have during a hurricane response. It's very, very underappreciated. There's some different tools you can actually use and maybe people don't necessarily know about for Google Maps. So it's very rare to see a bunch of National Guard soldiers on a hurricane response standing around a map as we had here. It was so different that I actually made sure I took a photo here because it's very rare that we have paper maps available. So what we're able to do using Google Maps is build out that intelligence preparation of the battlefield to kind of know our routes, know the major airports in the area. And we're able to build out these slide decks to make sure that the soldiers and specifically the leaders knew these key points of interest, whether they were major airports, major avenues of approach. How are we going to get from our basing down to Miami Airport, which is what we anticipated being our staging location. So we're able to build out multiple routes and get this information and download these offline maps so that if we lost internet connectivity during going through the Okeechobee area, for instance, or around in the middle of nowhere, would be okay without having cell phone reception. One of the cool things we did when we actually were working with one of the local sheriff's office was that they had a Google map, and this was kind of what inspired some of our work, is they were able to identify the zones of responsibility, their flooding areas, firearms dealers, box stores, because if there was potential for looting or for civil unrest during the response efforts, you wanted to know where you could go. So we took this map when we embedded with them, and we're able to figure out where to allocate our personnel because we could look at the different hotspots of there's a lot of pawn stores in this area, there's a lot of firearms dealers, a lot of box stores, which are key areas when you start thinking about civil unrest or looting response. So we took that and developed our own. So this was from our Hurricane Dorian, but we were able to go through and share across the battalion where the fuel stops were. We knew where places that had fuel. We knew where the shelters were. We knew where the emergency operations centers. So we were able to build this dynamic map that was able to be shared across the battalion so people could know where to hit when they needed different resupply. So that talked a little bit about Google Maps so we could find out where we were going and where we were at. One of the other big things we ran into very frequently is purchase orders. During hurricane response is oftentimes you deploy rapidly. You don't necessarily have all supplies. You don't necessarily have your FMTs, your mechanics with you. You don't necessarily have records. So oftentimes you'll have to purchase or get approval to purchase supplies in the local economy. So these were a couple of the great forms that the state had produced on a vendor request. If you wanted to get meals, lodging, office supplies, fuel, repair parts, or rent equipment, you had to fill out these forms, and they had to be sent all the way up through the battalion up to the state for approval. These were fillable PDF, but they were digital forms that you had to fill out for every single request, oftentimes multiple times per day. One of the real difficulties was you're in the back of a Humvee on a hurricane response. How are you going to get this filled out? How are you going to get it CAC signed by your unit commander in order to get approval for this? And oftentimes it would take 12, 24, 48 hours to get approval. So you can see example of one of my email inboxes during a hurricane. So if you see up in the top right hand corner, it's 1 to 10 of many. Quite often this was the only way we were tracking the purchase order request at the time, is you would be able to fill out these forms, somehow manage to get on a laptop, get them CAC signed by your commander, and send them up through the battalion, sometimes 2, 3, 4 times a day, as I mentioned. And there was a processing delay. It was hard to track the status. So what did we do? We started developing a process built around DocuSign. In particular, there's a couple other products on the market. We never got to a full implementation of this workflow, but this was something that we made recommendations to hire to look at a little bit. Because using a fillable PDF with digital signatures that you can do from any mobile device, you are able to add that signature routing so that we would actually have the auditing, the verification around purchases, and also give a much quicker update when things were pending approval. We would know what status they were in. We also knew when they were approved by the state. This is one of those things, like I said, we never got to full implementation of this, but this is one of those things that I would highly recommend that they look at more closely, because it gives you that verified piece that you can give to the vendor so that they can track back to those requests. As you saw in my email a minute ago, there's 20, 30, 40 purchase orders for a unit going out that were pending requests, that had signatures, that needed to be coordinated with the vendor for invoice payment. It got quite difficult. When you have something like DocuSign, is you can very easily organize that and track it through the full workflow. So naturally, anytime you deal with all this technology, there's risks. You have your 3A's, your authentication, your authorization, and your accounting. So one of the big pieces was mobile access, as oftentimes you'll have limited laptop access, like I mentioned. Very rarely would you ever have access to like a military issued, like a state issued laptop. So to get on some of like the secured SharePoint sites internal to the network, so you'd have to get on a government laptop, CAC enabled, Wi-Fi hotspot, VPN in. It was very, very difficult. So what we started doing, actually one of the things to mention is during the 5 hurricanes, very rarely did we actually lose good cell phone reception, because companies like T-Mobile, your AT&T, your Verizon would be out there very quickly responding. The picture on the bottom left showed that everything else might be demolished, but some of those cell phone towers managed to stay standing. Or the picture on the right that has T-Mobile, the quick setup sites to get that cell phone reception going again. And we tried to design all of these tools that we built for tracking around mobile friendly, so you could see that it actually scales pretty well down to a mobile device. So then you have your authentication and roles. So NAC was pretty good, is that it has the ability to secure individual pages, every page, down to specific roles. Maybe roles can only update certain pieces of information, which is pretty handy. So you can limit it to who actually has the authorization. Maybe some soldiers only have read-only access versus the leadership can actually help update the information, and then have approvals based on the requests going through. One of the other cool pieces for NAC, but I'm sure a lot of the other low-code solutions, is also audit tracking. As I could tell who updated, when they updated it, where it came from, and what values were updated in the fields. So it kind of feeds back into that last updated by, is I can know that, hey, this unit updated their MRE count from 200 down to 150. I know when they did it, so there was no question about necessarily, like I said, when it was done, who did it, or what information was changed. So some of the lessons learned is, don't assume that higher headquarters has true situational awareness. They depend on timely and accurate reporting to make those decisions. And the only way you can give them timely and accurate reporting is to build a system that doesn't require going through 5 different headquarters, whether it's the platoon and the battery and the battalion and the brigade, in order to get that information. And also, it really, really helps to have that headquarters units to have at least one tech-savvy soldier that can help maintain that information management system. It's not like a digital liaison detachment type piece, or like those embedded technically proficient soldiers. Having that one tech nerd inside the battalion can really kind of change the game to help organize the data. It'd be really nice if they had that at echelons like your brigade or your joint operations center up at your state to help track and collect that information. Those data points and those reporting requirements sometimes change several times today. And it's those things, those static information management systems will probably not be able to adjust in a timely manner, and not in a cohesive way, because people are updating old reporting formats and sending them up. So those are a couple of the lessons learned. So thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation today. I had a lot of information I wanted to go through, and I probably didn't get through probably about 30 of things I would love to talk about. But thank you for taking a chance to listen to this. I welcome feedback, good, bad, indifferent, on the presentation and the content. Visit the website, mattgwagner.com/feedback. I'm available for questions. I'm really, really passionate about this subject, is helping the units, helping the battalions, helping the brigades collect and disseminate and understand this information, so that we can actually help the soldiers and help the communities that we're in. It's part of my passion, both in the National Guard and in my civilian job. Again, I really appreciate you taking the time. Provide some feedback. Let me know what you thought of it. And thank you for the opportunity to give this presentation today. Thanks.